The Further Education of OverSoul 7 by Jane Roberts. Read by Martin John. Chapter 18. Seven's disquieting interview with Christ. A multi-dimensional happening turns into an insane vision, and Jeffrey Boy becomes a character in a book. OverSoul 7 found himself in front of Christ's golden couch, and he was so confused that he kept changing images faster than even he thought he could, in an effort to settle on one that might placate the glowering Christ, whose commanding eyes never left Seven's face for one divine moment. He didn't even blink, Seven told Cypress later. Seven felt an apology on the tip of his newly formed tongue. He took the shape of a 14-year-old, since he understood that Christ particularly liked children. "Well, what do you have to say for yourself?" Christ demanded. Then, as Seven's boy image stabilized, "Oh, you're a very young soul," Christ exclaimed in a somewhat mollified voice. "Well, verily," he added, in a still softer tone. "I'm terribly sorry that you were crucified to begin with," Seven replied quickly. "I hope you don't hold a grudge against the world, though. I mean, well, I didn't have a thing to do with it at all." Someone chuckled, and Seven suddenly became aware of Zeus, who appeared at Christ's right side. Zeus was eating from a leg of roasted mutton. Still laughing, he offered some to Christ, who shook his gray curls impatiently and said, "No, this whole affair has taken away my appetite for dinner." Zeus stared rather compassionately at Seven, who was just beginning to get his breath, and asked in a voice that was somehow sweet and threatening at the same time, "So you have a taste for the gods, huh?" Seven whispered, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." "No, that isn't right. It's render unto God the things that..." Well, surely you recognize the quote. What I mean is that I let the gods go their way, and hope they allow me to do the same." Seven paused, and then added to Christ, "The quote was yours, wasn't it, sir? Or perhaps I should say, Your Excellency?" "Oh, all right, I'll take a bit of that mutton," Christ said quarrelsomely to Zeus, and to Seven. "I don't care how you address me, but that quote isn't me. I never said that. I don't care if it makes good sense or poor sense. The fact is that I never said those words in that manner." "I didn't mean to misquote you," Seven said uneasily. "If you say you didn't say it, well, that's enough for me." Actually, Seven was growing more ill at ease every moment. Earlier, he'd been frightened, but now Christ's power seemed to be diminishing to a point where Seven was almost embarrassed for him. Christ was nibbling from the mutton, for example, eating without a knife or fork, he and Zeus both taking very full mouthfuls, with Christ having trouble with the tougher portions. As Seven tried to look away politely, Zeus put his chunk of meat down on the coffee table and said thoughtfully, "You know, Christ, you could have said that give to Caesar quote and forgotten. In a lifetime, a person, even a god, speaks so many words that surely it's possible that your divine tongue enunciated that particular verbal sequence and Christ's eyes blazed dangerously. He spat out a bit of meat into his napkin and said, very emphatically and deliberately, "I did not say those words, and I didn't curse the poor fig tree either. Being misquoted is one of the worst things that can happen to a God's message, and it happens all the time. Then, of course, it's repeated endlessly." "Endlessly!" Christ's voice grew morose. His divine eyes wandered. Seven thought that if this kind of behavior kept up, Christ might even forget that he was there, and he could sneak away. "Endlessly," Christ repeated, staring at Seven. It was quite possible, Seven thought, that Christ's memory was slipping. But even as Seven thought those words, Christ's head snapped forward. The divine eyes came afire, and Christ said, "So you think I'm losing my memory, do you? I remember the beginning of the world." Once more his eyes dimmed. "Those were the days," he muttered. Seven was ready to weep. If this was Christ, the legends far surpassed the reality. He was almost always disappointed meeting an author in person. But this? He lowered his eyes and looked at the floorboards. They began to shimmer. Somewhere, Seven thought that he heard Zeus and Christ laughed. Massive chuckles that disturbed birds in their flights through a million skies. Laughs that admitted divine humor, compassionate but largely lost to any but godly ears. Gradually the chuckles changed in character, though they continued until Seven thought they'd sounded for eternity. Realizing that he'd closed his eyes, he opened them. Then he rubbed them. There were torn magazines on the coffee table where only a moment earlier there had been, instead, a plate of mutton. The golden couch was replaced by several rickety chairs, and instead of Christ and Zeus, Geoffrey Boy and his Ram sat with the coffee table between them. Queen Alice, on the other side of the table, said, "Ideas of sanity are so limiting, don't you think? That's why people who think they're sane get in so much trouble when they realize that they're actually bigger than their concepts give them the right to be." Geoffrey said, "This is ridiculous." He ignored Queen Alice and turned to Ram, who shrugged his shoulders comically at Queen Alice and said, "Geoffrey Boy just can't get all this through his head." Then to Geoffrey, "You want to know if I was really in your apartment the other afternoon? I was. Now, does that answer your question?" "It does, and it doesn't," Geoffrey replied with some irritation. "Were you there physically?" "Definitely not," Ram said. Then, with the kindly old psychologist's smile, I know. You have more questions, but let's take them one at a time." "You're the one who's in the mental institution," Geoffrey shouted. "So don't give me advice." "Quite right," Ram said agreeably. "If there are gods, they'd be considered insane too," Queen Alice said musingly. She tucked her blue and white checkered shirt in under her dungarees, untucked it again, and said triumphantly, "Many of the insane speak for the gods all the time. 3 Christs have come and gone from this very institution since I've been here. And they weren't missed either, I'll tell you. They were all fanatics." Stoically, Geoffrey waited until Queen Alice finished speaking. Then he said desperately to Ram, "I thought that I had an entire conversation with you in my apartment. Then you disappeared. Now you tell me that you were there, but not physically. In other words, our insane data agree, facts that simply cannot be facts." "They are facts, they are, Geoffrey boy," Ram shouted excitedly. "But in a different kind of fact system. That's what I'm trying to get across to you," Ram broke off. A lovely young girl came over from the other side of the room, offering tiny pieces of a candy bar that she'd obviously slivered into numberless bits of chocolate. She curtsied. Ram smiled, said, "Thank you, my dear," in a sweet but grand fashion, offered a piece to Queen Alice, and turned back to Geoffrey. "There's another one," Queen Alice whispered, poking Geoffrey, who quickly recoiled. Ram noticed and chuckled. Geoffrey said, exasperated, "Another what?" "Why, another Christ. The only one left here. And the nicest we've had by far," Queen Alice said. Standing, and despite himself, Geoffrey noticed that for all of her years she was as supple as a girl. Her white hair looked almost blonde for a moment in the afternoon sunlight that came through the yellow plastic curtains at the windows by the TV set. For a wild moment, Geoffrey almost felt that she was younger than he was. "Oh, yes, she thinks she's Christ," Queen Alice said gaily. "The psychologists keep trying to tell her that she must be the Blessed Virgin instead, because there are certain conventions to follow whether you're crazy or not." She smiled innocently, rubbing her wrinkled chin with a rather grubby finger, and added, "If you're female and think you're a god, then they think you're crazier than a male who thinks the same thing, because at least he has his sexes straight. See?" Geoffrey's eyes widened incredulously. He fumbled nervously with the buttons of his properly rumpled sweater and said to Ram, "Do you understand what she's talking about?" Yes. "And she's quite right," exclaimed Ram. "This place has the richest psychological climate in the world, you know. Cynthia, the girl with the chocolate, doesn't necessarily think that Christ was a woman, but that she is a woman and she is Christ. A subtle difference, don't you see? She annoys our psychological colleagues no end, of course, but she won't back down and be the Virgin Mary. Watch. Look now." Ram pointed, and Geoffrey turned to see Cynthia, a girl in her 20s, move among the multitude. At least, from her manner of bearing, that was certainly what she thought she was doing, offering each inmate a sliver of chocolate, smiling with the sweetest generosity, so that Geoffrey himself was almost taken in, at least for a moment. "Why, it's incredible. She obviously believes it," he gasped. Ram was getting more and more excited. He wet his lips, and, as if addressing a class, he said to Geoffrey, Don't you see? Her father brings her the candy bars. She distributes them instead of the fishes." Queen Alice said comfortedly, "She's writing a Bible of her own in her spare time. I might help her type it." "Oh God," Geoffrey cried. "You are really mad, the both of you. What do you expect? This is a mental institution," Ram said, laughing then slyly. "Without madness, there'd be no sanity in the world. Don't you agree, Queen Alice?" Geoffrey didn't hear her answer. He sat with his head in his arms, overcome by the deepest sense of desolation he'd ever known. "And I must share some of that madness," he said soberly. "I thought I saw you physically in my apartment, and physically at least you were here. There must be a kind of contagion, so that the brain is no longer distinguishes reality. It must perceive bits and pieces that don't agree. Maybe I mixed a memory of a past visit of yours with reality." Now, don't take it so hard," Ram said. He took Geoffrey's hand reassuringly before Geoffrey wrenched it away. The girl, Cynthia, hearing the commotion, came over and offered Geoffrey another sliver of chocolate. "Take it away," he said angrily. Then, looking up, he saw her eyes. They weren't Christ's eyes. Who knew what Christ's eyes looked like? But they were the eyes Christ should have had, in which all contradictions vanished or were resolved, in whose glance he suddenly saw himself a person of dignity despite all of his own vast misunderstandings. He took the candy and said, "Thank you," with the simplicity and grace he didn't know he possessed. Queen Alice was sitting down again, studying her hands. Ram seemed to have fallen asleep in the hard-backed chair, or he was pretending to be dozing, as a hospital patient might when wishing that a visitor would leave. With a slight shock, Geoffrey realized that no one was paying him any attention at all. He might as well have been invisible. Queen Alice picked up a magazine. Someone turned up the volume on the TV set. A ball game came on, and the spectators' shouts filled the room. It was as if he'd already left, Geoffrey thought. He coughed, picked up his jacket, and turned to leave. As he did, the sound of the spectators at the televised ball game seemed to rise in volume, and the applause and shouts suddenly roused OverSoul Sephan back to himself. Instantly he remembered the giant chuckles of the gods that propelled him here. But he'd experienced the entire scene through Geoffrey. When he discovered this, OverSoul Sephan was considerably shaken and confused. "Why, Geoffrey?" he wondered. Geoffrey wasn't even one of his own personalities. And then, as he thought of the gods and Geoffrey, between one moment and the next, the two environments, the Olympian rest home and Ram's mental institution, met and merged, attaining such unimaginable dimensions that Sephan called out for Cyprus. There was no answer. Instead, the dizzying transformation continued. The gods' rest home with Zeus and Christ and the golden couch suddenly transposed over the institution's common room. The magazines on the coffee table fluttered madly through the air, landing on Christ's couch. The television set, still showing the ball game, now sat in the god's rest home, with Zeus madly adding his shouts to those of the spectators. Worse, Geoffrey, who was just leaving the common room, suddenly, somehow, turned into Will, and stayed. Queen Alice became Zeus's wife, Hera, and Ram, like some mad director, was himself as the godologist Ram as well. Seven was reeling, trying to keep it all straight. In the next moment, however, all the surroundings expanded. Zeus and Christ, all the inmates of the institution, and all the gods in the rest home merged into one wildly incoherent super-god, but one so ancient, so grandly senile, so sweetly insane, that even the grasses trembled at the very thought of his approach. For now, in the next scene, Seven saw the world ruled by this spectacular entity, and heard the tempting senile god's voice as it drifted eerily through all the secret places in the universe, into forest corners, into the deepest, most inaccessible ocean caves, into the invisible closets of people's minds, and despite himself, Seven was terrified. He saw frightened pigeons fly to hiding places. He felt the god's breath shake the world to bits in endless autumns, leaves committing exultant suicide. "Aha!" Will yelled, dying with each leaf, and he felt each living thing tremble, trying to preserve its life in the face of such cosmic temper tantrums. This god's insanity whispered crookedly through men's chromosomes, tainting them with flaws beyond number. The senile god shouted his incoherent truth to the multitudes, who in turn killed their neighbors and rode in bitter triumph through endless savage wars. Mad Muhammad flashed his eternal sword. Jehovah, in fits of holy tremors, sent down his plagues and flood. Jupiter and Thor threw their thunderbolts, while Buddha contemplated his divine navel. In the streets his gurus sprinkled holy ash. Seven screamed, "Stop!" The insane god, who was at once Jehovah, Buddha, and all the others, paused and seemed to notice OverSoul 7 for the first time. The earth that Seven was seeing took on the god's features, so that Seven saw the treetops spinning in the wind as the shaken, tousled curls of Christ's head. The oceans, the depthless pools of his insane delight, and the undurable realization of his plight. For this god knew he was a demon, raging, possessing the earth, turning it to his own cosmic, insane pitch, until surely one day, today or tomorrow or in 1,000,000 years, that pitch would become so agonizing that the god's mind would split, divine neurons spilling out into mortality, the blessed essence contaminated beyond degree and lost. This was an insane vision. Seven tried to clear his consciousness, to shake it loose from the strands of despair that threatened to send him reeling into extinction. Hopelessly, he suddenly saw Lydia and Will falling through unnumbered days that wound back to the insane god's infancy. "I won't live in such a world," Will was shouting. His voice splintered the air beneath him, and at the same time his memories poured out of his mind into space. And Lydia, furiously angry, stood for a moment, shaking her fists at the universe. "I won't be born again in this mad world." She was going to say more, but the insane god's eye blinked and Lydia twirled, turning smaller and smaller, blown willy-nilly by the thunderous power of that divine blinking eye. Seven's astonishment at all of this slowed his reactions. What nightmare was this? But he couldn't seem to break its spell, and the psychological implications of this disastrous vision were all too clear. He had to break away for Lydia and Will, and if they were lost, but how could they be? Again Seven cried out for Cypress. This time she responded so abruptly and severely that Seven was snapped back to himself, so quickly that he felt as if a million shocks surged through the most vital portions of his consciousness. "Seven, how could you have allowed such a thing to happen?" Cypress exclaimed, though exclaimed isn't quite the word. Seven felt her disapproval, or rather her sorrow. But before he could respond, he watched as her image appeared simultaneously to Will and Lydia, who seemed to be in the distance below him. Lydia looked incredulous and angry. Will looked defiant and scared to death. Seven watched as Cypress formed a gentle summertime hill beneath them. Then she talked to them quietly before returning to Seven. "What happened?" Seven asked impatiently. "What did I do wrong? And how much will Lydia and Will remember? Was Will on drugs or something?" He was still shaking himself, and he noticed that Cypress wasn't consoling him. Instead, she said, "Look for yourself," and she and Seven stood invisibly in Will's bedroom. Will lived in a loosely knit commune, that is, young people constantly came and went. Will's cot, with his name painted on it, sat behind a huge rubber plant, and beside this sat the 2 orange crates that Will used as a desk. The plant and crates marked this corner of the large room as Will's property, and above the bed a poster of Buddha steered blissfully over Will's pillow. Will considered himself quite lucky, since his corner possessed a window, half of which he covered with a map of the world. Now he lay curled up at the head of the cot, wondering if he felt strong enough to make it to the communal sink to wash his face, or even further to the refrigerator where his food, oranges, was stacked on the third shelf. There were 10 other cots scattered around the room, each one marked in one way or another as private property. But for now, Will was alone. He'd just awakened from a terrible nightmare, or so he thought, except for the ending where he was sunbathing on a hill, and he supposed that one or a combination of the drugs he'd been taking had caused the particularly frightening sense of insanity he dimly remembered. But now everything looked normal, which meant shitty and dismal, he thought. Reaching under his mattress, he felt around until his trembling fingers found his potpourri of pills, his cache that he kept hidden there. Without even looking to see what particular pills he grabbed, he popped 2. OverSoul 7 said to Cypress, "He does it all the time." Will's eyelids fluttered. He began muttering. Cypress sighed. "What you experienced earlier was a nightmare, all right, composed of Will and Lydia's worst fears about God and the universe. And you should have monitored it for them, not falling into it yourself." Will's mutterings grew louder. At the same time, he began to rouse in his dream body. "You stay with him now," Cypress said. "I want to have a good talk with you later." "What about Lydia?" Seven cried. "I should get back to her, shouldn't I?" But there was no reply, and in any case it was too late. Will stood in his dream body, eyeing Seven. "Well, I've done it again," Will said sheepishly. "You're here, and you're one of my most exasperating trips." Actually, he felt quite satisfied with himself for the moment. He knew he was trippin', but he'd decided OverSoul 7 was some kind of symbol that meant he was safe, or nearly. In fact, for no reason at all, he felt cocky. "If you're a figment of my imagination, I'm pretty good," he said to Seven. "I'm sorry I can't return the compliment," Seven grumbled. "How come I feel so great?" Will cried. Seven answered, "Cypress gave you additional energy, but then you probably wouldn't remember." He himself felt quite glum indeed, and his mood didn't improve as Will ran up and down the room shouting, "I'm out of my body! I'm out of my body!" "You're strung out on drugs, too," Seven cried angrily. "And if it wasn't for me, who knows what trouble you might be getting into." "So what?" Will shouted happily. "I'm out of my body, and you're here, and for once we aren't in a classroom. Is my wish your command? By the way," Will eyed Seven speculatively and added, "because on my last trip I had a terrible experience about an insane god or something, and I don't want that one again. If you're like a genie, well, I can go where I want to." "I'm not like a genie," Seven said. "Well, anyhow, God was miserable." "But let's take a trip to see his mother," Will declared. "Whose mother?" Seven asked uneasily. "Why, Christ. She'd know all about him, wouldn't she?" Will replied. "After all, who knew him better?" Will started giggling. "Forget it," Seven said. "And anyway, why Christ's mother?" Why not? Will said angrily. And if I'm trippin', well, it's my trip, isn't it? He grinned brilliantly and added, and somehow I seem to have you where I want you for a change. That's what you think, Seven muttered to himself. But there was no doubt that he had to stay with Will for a while. And he didn't like the new turn of events. How much bleed-through was there, actually, from one personality's experience to another? Without knowing the details, was Will somehow aware of Lydia's search for the gods and its so far unhappy results? He must be, Seven thought, staring at Will. Otherwise, Lydia and Will wouldn't have been involved in the same awful, nightmarish experience. Well, Will demanded, and despite himself, Seven was caught between exasperation and appreciation. There Will stood, arrogant and sassy, and looking like a young god himself, filled right now with fresh determination. But determination to do what? Because in the next moment, Will said, I'm probably going to commit suicide the first chance I get. So you really shouldn't refuse me any favors, or you'll be sorry later. And I want to visit the Virgin Mary. If that's within your province, of course. Seven sighed. Will's last remark made a certain kind of unfortunate sense. I can't guarantee that will happen, Seven said nervously. I wish you'd change your mind. Not on your life. Not on your life. Not on your life. Will started, chanting the words over and over, and Seven wished wholeheartedly that Cyprus hadn't given him quite so much energy. Have it your way, Seven said. Will could have sworn that no transition had occurred, but now he and Seven were travelers. In Chapter 18, Peace, Light, and Love. Aloha.